You got me on? Okay. We good? Okay. I just was waiting on that final wave. Well, for those of you who decided to stay, thank you so much. And for everybody who's joining us online, this is our last class here in the book of Exodus here. So we've been through all of this and get to highlight that last line here finally. And then Wednesday we will have our usual transition class, and then as was just announced, we will have our somewhat normal class schedule starting up next weekend, and then there will be an adult class in here on the book of Romans, and then there also will be a college age class, which I've been asked to be part of that teaching group there for that in the auditorium. And then there will be kids classes too, so I'm excited for that to start again. Since this is our last class, I thought that I would just take advantage of that. One of the things that you get to do as being a teacher is you get to talk about yourself or things that were important to you. And so I thought for a few minutes here, I would echo some of Jay's comments on Wednesday and just talk a little bit about 2020 and some things that I learned and how it impacted me and some of that. Fortunately or not, I was one of the teachers both in the class in trimester 1 in January of this year, and also in trimester 3, teaching right here in the auditorium. Back in the first trimester, myself and Paul Cook and Ben Wright were teaching the book of Genesis. And so then, of course, when it came to the third trimester, and they asked me to teach here in the book of Exodus, it gave me an opportunity to teach with 2 generations of Wrights in the same year. I've never done that before. In fact, I think this is my first time teaching with both Ben and Jay, and it did amaze me how similar they are. Very similar both in their approach to study and in their presentation. Great job, both of them, of course. And then it just happened to be I taught 2 consecutive books, the book of Genesis and then the book of Exodus. And obviously, of course, both classes have been impacted by the virus. I can't remember now if it was myself or Paul who ended up teaching that last class and then just all of a sudden nothing, right? I mean, we went from, man, it was going great. I love the book of Genesis. It's a great class to teach, and Paul and Ben were great co-teachers, and then all of a sudden, stop. And then, of course, this trimester has had some challenges also. Well, a few things that I just want to talk about that I learned about me. One of those things is watching those videos, man, I really got to lose some weight. They say, that the camera adds 10 pounds, and it's kind of an old joke. We only have 2. Man, they added 100 pounds each, I'm telling you. And, of course, YouTube, those still shots, every time we take a YouTube recording and we post it online, YouTube decides, unless Stuart or one of them goes in and sets that still shot, YouTube just kind of guesses at a still frame of the video, and YouTube still shots are not my friend. Now, Sterling, YouTube loves Sterling. He's Mr. GQ up there, and he always looked good in all of his shots. And then, of course, Jay, looks very studious, always very, composed whenever it decided. But for me, it was all over the board. Sometimes I'm pointing. Sometimes I'm doing like karate chops. I don't know what's going on. Sometimes I just don't even know what I'm doing, I think. And then another time, this is my favorite. I don't know, I'm sniffing something or what. eyes closed and crazy smile on my face. Love me anyway. I'm not a great looking guy to begin with. I way married up, and then YouTube didn't help me at all this year. I also learned that really online classes are not really for me. I don't like listening to them. I've never been a guy who listens to a lot of offline podcasts or watches a ton of videos on my own. I much more enjoy sitting and listening and having a chance to respond and hearing what other people in the class say. And for me teaching them, I really don't like doing it. This is no different, really, when we have people in the auditorium. But if you've never had the opportunity, you don't want it, to come in here to a completely empty auditorium and try to teach a class like you normally would. I'd rather sit at home in front of my computer and do it than just feel alone. There's even though Stuart or somebody was always here, and there's usually one or two other people here, man, you want to feel isolated, stand up here in front of an empty auditorium and try to teach a class. It's pretty sad. And I learned something that I thought I knew, but I know for sure now that in any class, I need the audience there way more than the audience needs me as the teacher. Just that feedback and the energy, even, the smiles and the way people respond and body language, that really drives me as a teacher. So I am super excited for the opportunity to teach in front of a crowd on a regular basis. Again, I think that's going to be really big. If we look back at this year then, and especially in this trimester studying the book of Exodus, a lot of people might say, why did we even study the Old Testament these days? Why do we take the time to go back and look at some of these passages and see some of these events that happened thousands of years ago? I mean, after all, really only the New Testament is required to get to heaven, right? You only need to know the New Testament to know about Jesus and forgiveness and baptism and the Lord's Supper and meeting as Christians. I mean, Christians aren't mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament, right? And I think that is partly true. I would never say that somebody who only had been taught the New Testament couldn't be saved. I think that a lot of people, that's where you start, right? And, think about some of the people in the Bible who were non-Jews, who were introduced to Christianity and to Christ. They didn't know that entire backstory. They didn't know the Old Testament. They didn't know the history of the Pentateuch. They didn't know all these events that had happened in Exodus, and they were able to be saved. But I would ask that question, is studying the Old Testament important? Is it required? Maybe not. Is it important? Absolutely. Let's just take this class alone, okay? Just in this class, let's think about some things that we have covered. Some commonly known stories. Stories from the Bible that are so well known that they have made it into our vernacular as a country. Even people who might not understand the quotes that they are saying or the things that they're talking about, they will recognize some of these things. Baby Moses being saved in a basket, okay? People know all about that. The burning bush. How many people have you heard mention the burning bush? They probably don't even know what it really means, okay? The plagues, of course, that happened in Egypt. The parting of the Red Sea. I mean, that's in so many popular movies and things. People see that. And of course, in our society, especially in the last 20 years, this idea of the 10 Commandments and what role do they play? Should they play? Can we have them posted somewhere? Can you even read them? Are they even valid? I mean, those are the kind of things that have made it into our society. And all of those things we've talked about in this class. In this class, we've talked about some very key elements of the Bible story, what it means to be free from slavery and from that bondage, and how does that carry forward, how you can obtain salvation through water. We find that entire passage in 1 Corinthians that explains about baptism and the mist and how the entire nation of Israel went through their own baptism as they passed under the water in the midst of the Red Sea. Of course, this idea of the Passover and the sacrificial lamb, and what does that mean? And why was Jesus crucified on this event called the Passover? What did that tell us? We looked at all of that in this class. Of course, what is a prophet? And what role does a prophet play in Scripture? After all, we run into the very first prophet in the book of Exodus. Moses really is the first prophet. God even had to explain to him what a prophet was. And of course, this idea of a tabernacle, where God dwells. How would you possibly understand the New Testament passages that talk about we are the new tabernacle? What does that mean if you can't read these passages? And then, of course, all throughout the New Testament, especially if you read Jesus' story just in the Gospels, what did he live under? Well, he lived under the law. And whenever he was talking with the scribes and with the Pharisees, and they were trying to catch him in these fine points of the law, well, what law? The very law that we saw given right here in this class this trimester. What are some things we learned from the law that we just looked at? And we didn't even read all of it, obviously. There's much more of it contained in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, a lot of it repeated again and more details flushed out there. But still, we learned about God wants to enter into a voluntary covenant with man. He doesn't want to just impose his will and make us robots. He wants us to want him. Now, he loved us first, and no different than he did with the Israelites here. He saved them first before they agreed, but then he presented himself as, I'm the God who saved you from these things, and I want to be special to you, and I want you to be a special people to me, but you have to agree to these conditions. We learn about that here for the first time. What is the priesthood? What is sacrifice? What does it mean to be sanctified? We had several chapters that we just went over recently where there's an entire process for these elements that were built for the tabernacle to be sanctified and made holy, for the priests before they could go into certain places, before they could do certain things, they had to be sanctified. Well, what does that even mean? You can't understand that without studying verses like this. What is sin? And why do we need a mediator? Why do we need somebody to be between us and God? All of those were topics that we talked about in this class. So is it important to study the Old Testament? Is it important for us to spend time in books like Exodus and even time in some of the chapters that were kind of boring, describing, in exact detail the width and length of the table and the height of the candle thing and all those kind of stuff? Is that really important? You better believe it is. It's critically important to building our faith and to understanding these things that we would base our entire future on, that relationship that we have with God. What I wanted to do the rest of the class then, kind of in a little bit of summary and also a little bit of just an extra topic that we would talk about here. If you look at the book of Exodus, there's one person, maybe even more than God himself, who plays the key part of the book of Exodus. Of course, God is the driver. He's the one who does all the great things. But who is talked about more in the book of Exodus than even God? Who's the central figure? Moses. That's right. So I thought we would spend a little bit of time just talking about Moses. And really, I think we take so many things for granted just how special a person Moses was. We talk about Jesus and how very unique he was in all of history, and very true. Jesus is unique in so many ways, but do you know who else was very unique and a very special person? This guy named Moses. In all of the Bible story, all the great characters that we're introduced to, and all the wonderful things that they do, there is no one like Moses. And in fact, God himself tells us that there is no one before and no one since, just like Moses here. Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 10, of course, that's not part of what we read here. So now they are, they've left Sinai. They've already tried to, God took them up and told them to go take the land, but the 12 spies decided that it was 10 of the spies decided that they shouldn't do that, and so the people listened. They've had to wander. They come back around, and they're ready to cross over into the land. And as we know, Moses was not allowed to go in. So he's taken up on a mountain where he dies. But look at what God said of him at the end of his life. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. So one way in which he was unique was in how he was the first and only prophet. Then there hasn't been one like him since. Another way is how he speaks to God, whom the Lord knew face to face. Even Abraham, who it says was a friend of God, called a friend of God, didn't speak to God face to face like Moses did. There's not arisen anyone who spoke to God that way since then. And then, of course, we find in Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, exactly what that means. This is talking about, you may remember, the tent of meeting. So now it has been set up outside of the tent, and Moses goes out there to talk with God. And it said, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. It's the only person in the entire history that is said of, that he had that kind of relationship with God. He's also very special because of the power he wielded. Was it the power of God? Absolutely. But Moses was a unique instrument. Look at what it says there in Deuteronomy chapter 34 about this. There is none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his servants and to all the land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. No other single person has wielded the kind of power that Moses did. Jesus wielded even more power, but not things of terror, not things that impacted the entire nation like Moses did against the Egyptians. Nobody since has wielded that kind of power. And of course, he had a very unique relationship with God. And that relationship really formed him and formed a bunch of different things. He got to see so many different aspects of God. In fact, I believe he saw all the different personages and interacted with all three of the different personages of God. At the burning bush, we see one aspect. On Sinai, we see multiple aspects, different times where there's God at the top of the mountain, but then there's also God that he meets lower on. And two different aspects of God are talking to each other, and they're both talking to Moses. Nobody else has had that kind of experience. Of course, as we just read at the tent of meeting, he had this wonderful interaction with God, face to face. And then, of course, Moses, and all of his brashness and in his relationship with God, he's the only one who just demanded of God, let me see your glory. He's the only one who's had that view from the cleft of the rock as God passed by. He's also unique in how he spoke to God. Abraham talked to God and convinced him. You think about in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there is Abraham sitting down with an aspect of God and talking to him and trying to negotiate for the lives of people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, eventually, he gets him down to that famous story of Abraham saying, if we can find just 10 righteous people, will you not spare the city? And God agrees. But in reality, what still happened? He still destroyed it. That's right. Abraham wasn't able to change his mind. However, Moses is unique in that he did some things that nobody else probably would have had. I wouldn't have had the guts to do with him, right? He reminded God sometimes of his own words. Remember, we talked about there's that really strange interaction there at the base of Sinai where just before the covenant is going to be made, and there's going to be some of them who go up higher on the mountain in order to have that memorial feast, God tells Moses, only you and Aaron and a very select people, you come up. But then a different aspect of God tells him and says, no, you go ahead and bring the people this way. Remember what Moses said? Moses said, well, wait a minute, you told me not to bring them up here. Because if they came up here, you were going to consume them. And God relents and says, yeah, you're right. I told you not to bring them up. Leave them down there. Who else would have had that courage to say to God, well, wait a minute, you told me something else just a minute ago. How does that work? He's the only one that I know of in Scripture who was actually able to change God's mind. Remember the story of it happens several times, but the one that is the most clear in Scripture is whenever Moses is up on the mountain and he's getting what's going to be the tablets that he's going to break when he walks down. And God says, hey, you better go down and see about those people. And he actually tells Moses that you brought up out of Egypt. You better go down and take care of them because they're having a party down there and they've already gone astray. And by the way, when you get down there, I'm going to destroy them. Remember Moses saying, well, wait a minute, what are the Egyptians going to think? And what are all the rest of the world going to think? And the last part of that passage says, and God relented and did not do what he had spoken. God changed his mind. And Moses was able to do that. Moses is also the only one that I know was able to convince God to move to action. Remember we were talking about, and I think it was Sterling who taught this class about how that when they're getting ready to leave Sinai, because the people have been so bad, God says, well, hey, you're going to go, but I'm not going to go before you. I'll send somebody, but it's not going to be me. And then Moses goes to him and says, well, wait a minute, how can you do that? You can't leave us, and we need you to come with us. And what does God end up doing? He says, okay, I'll go. I don't know of anybody else who's been able to convince God to do something like that. And I think that he shows just how special of a relationship he has with God even after his death. And of course, to me, somebody who believes that I am seeing all three aspects of the Godhead here and how Moses is interacting with them, and means even more to me, here is Moses who's taking these people, he's going to start a new religion, he's going to deliver the law. He is the great prophet. And he's interacting with an aspect of God as a man does face to face, right? Now flash forward thousands of years and Jesus has been teaching and he's been bringing a new law and he's fulfilling the old covenant. And he's just about ready to go to his most trying time into Jerusalem. And he goes up on a mountain and he gets a visit from two people. Who's one of those two people who comes to talk with him? And Luke says, to prepare him for what was to come. Moses. Moses just had that special relationship. That whether you think Jesus was back there doing work in Moses' life or not, definitely Moses is brought forward to have a role in Jesus' life before he goes to his final temptation and death there. Okay? And lastly, the last way, and what we'll spend the rest of our time talking about here, and some of this I'm just going to go through very fast just for sake of time, but he is the only person who is explicitly named as a template for Christ. So yes, it's true, Melchizedek, right? Melchizedek Jesus was going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek, meaning that he was going to be a priest in the same way, not a priest of the Aaronic lineage, okay? But there's nobody else that it specifically says that was going to be a template for Jesus. In the New Testament, when Jesus is walking around, the Jews were constantly searching for the prophet. John chapter 1, verses 19 through 28, there's just some portions of this I'm going to put here. And they asked him, what then are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? And he answered, no. Who is the prophet there? And they asked him, why are you baptizing if you are neither the Christ nor Elijah nor the prophet? Who is that? Who are they looking for? Okay. Again, we have to go to the book of Deuteronomy, which was not part of Exodus, but is part of Moses' life here. And as he is doing that reciting to the people of Israel about what's going to happen here, and I apologize, this is probably a little small on the screen here. I tried to fit it all on here. But I'm going to be reading Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19, if you want to follow along there. He told the people of Israel, he promised them something very special because he knew they were going to not have him anymore. I mean, after all, he is the one who brought them together as a nation. He's the one who they begged to speak to God for them. He's the one who had done all these miraculous sights, and now he's going to be leaving them because he's not allowed to go into the land like they are. So look at what he promises them. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him who you shall listen. Moses is saying, even more than you have listened to me, this prophet that God is going to raise up, that is the one that you have to listen to. Just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God or see the great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, you are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. The Jews knew this, and they knew that God was going to raise up a prophet like Moses, someone after the same kind of prophet that Moses is. Moses was a template for this prophet who was going to come. So, of course, we know that while the Jews saw Jesus as a prophet like Moses, because that's the way it was explained, what do we know in reality? Moses was a prophet like Jesus was going to be. It wasn't that Moses was a pattern that Jesus was going to follow. It was that Jesus was the pattern, and God gave us in Moses a precursor, an example of what he was going to be. So we would know what to expect when he came. So in actuality, Moses was a prophet like Jesus. Moses is what we would call a type, prototype, foreshadowing of Jesus. You can read exactly about that in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. We're not going to take time to read that, but that's where he explicitly says, you want to understand Jesus? Go look at Moses and what he did. So I thought we would take a little bit of time this morning to go through and just look at some of those ways in which Moses and Jesus are compared, and then at the end, just a few things that made Jesus even more special than Moses. Moses and Jesus were both sent to be a prophet following 400 years of silence. So the entire time that the people of Israel were in captivity, God wasn't speaking to them. They were slaves. They didn't even know his name. They didn't know who he was anymore. 400 years of silence, and Moses shows up to lead them to do these great things. Now we see at the end of the Old Testament, we enter into that period of silence, we call it, right? Where God told them, you're going to be wanting the word of God like the land wants rain in a drought, because you're not going to hear from me. And then all of a sudden, this guy Jesus shows up and starts proclaiming the words of God. They were both born when Jews were under the control of another nation. Of course, Moses was born when the Jews were slaves to the Egypts. In fact, we already talked about he was only saved from being killed by his mom because the Egyptians were that afraid of the Jews. And of course, Jesus was born into a nation under complete Roman control. The rulers of both nations both tried to kill both of them, right? Moses wasn't killed specifically. No one was hunting for Moses specifically, but all of the males were being killed. Now, Herod, of course, was specifically targeting Jesus, but he didn't know who Jesus was. So what was his answer? Basically the same thing as Pharaoh, right? Just kill them all and we'll get him eventually. Okay. However, both were saved miraculously from this attempt on their life. Moses through the basket, and we can only see God's hand in that. And then, of course, we know Joseph is warned by an angel. You have to flee because Herod is trying to take the child's life. Not surprisingly then, another link that we're going to see here between them. When Joseph was warned, where was he warned to go to? To Egypt, right? So both of them were raised in Egypt. Moses was raised to privilege, raised to education. In fact, we have that movie called The Prince of Egypt, because that's how he was raised, in the household of Pharaoh as the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. Jesus, of course, was raised in Egypt until God told them it was safe to go back. So they both came from Egypt. They were both sent to free God's people. Moses to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Jesus to save all men from slavery to sin. They were both first rejected by their own people. Moses was initially rejected by the very people he was trying to save. At first they were like, oh yeah, this is great, someone's going to save us. But as soon as the troubles began, when he went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, Pharaoh put harder burden on them. What did they do? They wanted to kill him. Jesus himself was rejected by people. And whenever he stood up and he read that famous passage there and said, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. The blind are going to see, and the deaf are going to speak, and the poor are going to hear the words of God. And when he stood up and said, this is fulfilled, basically saying, I'm doing that, what did they do? They took him out and tried to kill him. They were both criticized by their immediate family. Of course, Aaron and Miriam constantly challenged Moses. We saw that here. It becomes even more evident in the book of Leviticus as they're traveling around constantly. Aaron and Miriam, get too big for their shorts, and Moses and God have to put them down. But Jesus, it tells us that his brothers and his family, except for his mom, all thought he was out of his mind. And probably for good reason, right? Here's a guy who is my brother for 30 years. He's been a little odd. He goes to the temple and stays there, and people think he's a teacher at 12 years old, but he's still just a normal guy. Until now, all of a sudden, at age 30, what does he start saying? I'm the Son of God. Can you imagine being his brother? Saying, wait a minute, how are you the Son of God and I'm not? So both their families criticized him. They both fasted alone for 40 days before delivering God's word. Moses was 40 days on the mountain with God at Sinai, fasting, preparing to deliver God's word to the people. Jesus, of course, spent 40 days in the wilderness before his trials and before beginning his work. You may remember when he was baptized and the Spirit came on as a dove, drove him into the wilderness so he could spend his 40 days there. Both of them are the only two people that I know of that God publicly acknowledged as his chosen. Several times Moses is challenged as why God picked you, why can't somebody else do this? And God shows in miraculous ways that Moses is the guy. Oftentimes killing off entire divisions of the people who were trying to revolt against Moses. And of course, the time from Sinai when God spoke to the people and they said, hey, we don't want that anymore. And then Moses goes up there and he comes back down and he's able to go into the tent of meeting, and he's the one who God allows to speak to him in that way. Jesus, of course, God verbally, twice, said out loud from heaven, this is my son. Both performed miracles to prove who they were. Remember when Moses said, hey, I'm going to go to these people and they're not going to believe me. What did God do? He said, I'm going to give you some power. And you're going to be able to use that power to convince people that I sent you. Jesus did the same thing. He said, I'm from God. I'm the Son of God. People said, well, I don't believe that. What did he do? He performed some pretty incredible miracles to prove that. They both performed great miracles over water. Moses, of course, parting the Red Sea, as we talked about. Jesus there on the Sea of Galilee just calmed it with a word. And then later also just walked on the water straight out to his disciples in the boat. They both provided food and water for their followers. Moses gave water from the rocks and prayed for manna and quail, and it came. Jesus, of course, gives everlasting water. He is the well from which if we drink, we'll never be thirsty again. And he provides his own body as our spiritual food. But even as a physical act, when he was with the people, he took twice just a few pieces of food and provided for an entire multitude. Both at times exhibited righteous anger over sin in God's presence. Moses, when he comes down and sees what was going on with the golden calf, he destroys the tablet and he punishes the people on top of what God does. He kind of takes it in his own hand to deliver some punishment to the people because he just has such a righteous anger. And of course, Jesus does that with the money changers and driving them out from the temple, actually taking a whip and beating them. We don't like to think about that side of Jesus. Scourging them to drive them out from the temple because he just was so angered by the blasphemy that the people had right in the presence of God. Both chose and sent others to fulfill missions. And it's interestingly enough, the numbers even match, right? Moses chose 12 spies to send forth, and he had 70 elders that he sent forth among the people to do his work. Jesus had 12 apostles that were going to be his primary ambassadors, and then he chose later 70 disciples to send them out. Even the numbers matched. They both interceded for the Jews. Several times, Moses pleads with God to save and spare the people. Of course, even on the cross, while he was hanging there, suffering terribly, Jesus begged God to forgive those who were doing it to him. Not only did they ask God to spare people, they both offered themselves up. Moses himself said, if you want to kill all these people, well, take me instead and blot my name out of your book, but save the people. And of course, Jesus took on the entire sin of the world. They both brought the law of God to his people. The Mosaic law, it's even called that because Moses is the one who delivered it. Jesus then completed that old law and brought the new. They both used blood to seal the covenants. Moses, the blood of animals. We talked about how that was put on the people and on the altar and how that was tying those covenants, sealing it in blood, sealing it with the death of someone. And Jesus used his own blood to seal the new covenant. And then, of course, both of them are seen after their death. Moses at the transfiguration, and Jesus is seen both at his ascension and from that time period from his resurrection to ascension, and then even seen in heaven when he appeared to Saul. Very similar. When God said, I'm going to raise up a prophet like you, he went out of his way to do things in the same way so that people would know that Jesus is the one who had been foretold from the beginning. But yet there were some things that were different and some things that Jesus did that were even better than Moses. Think about their attitudes toward their calling. Whenever Moses is first at the burning bush, what is he trying to do? He tries absolutely everything he can to get out of it, right? What about Jesus? Did he try to get out of it? He embraced his role as a teacher, even from a young age. And even when it came down to the fact of doing the absolute worst thing and having to go through that suffering on the cross, he asked God, let's find a different way. But if not, I'm the one, and I'll do it. God had to force Moses. Jesus did it willingly. The kinds of miracles that they did show just how different their mission was. Remember what it said in Deuteronomy about Moses? That no one has wielded the terror and the might of God like Moses has. Jesus brought even more powerful miracles, but they were just of a different type. He didn't make people sick. He didn't do things that harmed people like almost all of Moses' miracles were. Instead, he did acts of healing and resurrection. Think about how they were introduced to the people. When Moses was going to go to the people, he said, well, who do I tell them sent me? I need someone to do the introduction. Okay? Well, the only introduction he was given is use my name. Jesus' coming was so important that he needed somebody, or I shouldn't say needed, God wanted somebody to prepare the way. And he had told them that someone was coming to prepare the way. So, of course, John went and came and prepared the way. And then, of course, God himself introduces Jesus from heaven. Instead of just like Moses having to say, well, God sent me and here's his name, God himself said, no, this is my son. Their authority is the last point that I'll bring up. We talked about this when we talked about the burning bush and what does it mean that there is that special I am there, and it's really only used 2 places in the Bible. Who are the only 2 places that that's used around? Moses and Jesus. But what was the difference? Moses was told, when someone asks who sent you, you say, I am has sent you. And that was enough that God would then, the people would know that it was God, Jehovah, who had sent him. And Jesus, whenever he's being questioned and the people are challenging them, he didn't say, the I am sent me. What did he say? He said, I am. He spoke with that authority and with that power that nobody had. As great of a prophet as Moses was, and as great as all of these deeds we talked about in the book of Exodus were, I can't even imagine what it was like seeing those plagues brought against the Egyptians, seeing the Red Sea parted. I mean, I can't even picture that the movies do any kind of justice to what that must have been like. But as great as Moses was, he did all of the works in the name of I am. Jesus did his works, and the message that Jesus brought, he said, I'm bringing it in the name of the Father, but by the way, guess what? I am. Not I am sent me, I am. And if you didn't read this book of Exodus, and you didn't understand all of these things that were coming before, how could you really understand what it meant? When in the book of John you read, Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Very special book. And a lot of things I hope that you've taken away from this class. And whenever I was asked to be the lead teacher for this class, I was so happy that Sterling and Jay were going to be my co-teachers. And I thank them so much for the work they've done. I've really learned a lot this class, and I hope that you have too. But if there's something that I'll ask you to take with you, it's just that last point. That as great as Moses was, and as powerful as he seemed to the people, is nothing compared to the prophet that we have. He is a prophet truly like no other. There was no prophet before and no one since who talked to God and who brought the law of God like Moses did. And the reason that's true is because the one we serve was even greater. He wasn't exactly the same. He was even greater than Moses. Thank you so much, and I hope that if you're going to be in here in the class next time that you'll enjoy a class from the New Testament and the book of